Hello, and welcome to the Theological Family Ministry Podcast, a podcast for parents as well as children and youth ministry leaders. We are dedicated to showing how theological study and biblical application relate to the discipleship of children and youth. As always, we're hosted by Pastor Ben Palaz, the pastor of family and children's discipleship at Curtis Baptist Church in Augusta, Georgia, and Tony Trusoni, the family and student pastor at Faith Family Church in Finksburg, Maryland.
Okay, Tony, it's time to do this again. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How have you been doing?
Transitioning. Spring weather is kind of starting to seep in, at the end of February here. How about up there in Maryland?
Yeah, it's been really back and forward. Yesterday it was in the 50s, and today it's in the 30s. So you never know what it's going to be around here. But, the weird thing has been, we are a union state, northern state, relatively speaking. And, we normally get some snow up here, but we've really not gotten a single real snow at all this year.
Really?
It's been very light on that capacity, and it's felt like it's been spring the whole year, the whole winter, though. So
interesting. Okay. Yeah, we've had back and forth with cold. I mean, I think the low today is supposed to be in the 30s, or probably in the evening, but it's sunny right now. So it's been nice, but there's been a lot of rain, though, so it's kind of hard. The kids get trapped in the house all day, and, needless to say, they have lots of energy that doesn't always get used constructively. They can't go run and play. So
children have energy in the winter, no. So, but yeah, the warm months are so great with with that aspect. And, there's some part of me that likes seasons. I'm from the northern Midwest where, we have long, harsh winters, but, pretty nice summers. But, I'm all for not having seasons when I have kids in the home.
Well, I guess you could move to Hawaii or San Diego or someplace like that, but cost of living goes up pretty high. With the spring kind of rolling in, baseball season is what's sort of underway. The folks that are spring training games are going on. They don't really matter, but I'm looking forward to baseball season. How about you?
Yeah, definitely. So it'll be. It's funny. I always get excited about it and plan on following it pretty closely, more than I did the previous year, and then I always follow it even less each year than I did the previous year. And I haven't had as much time for it the past several years, but so this year I'm going to amp up and get ready to follow baseball, and then forget about it a day or two in. We'll see.
Yeah, I really, the way I keep up with it is checking scores online, but I don't watch the games. I don't think I watched a single game last year until I did see a little bit of the playoffs, which was heartbreaking. And so we know this year your Orioles are going to get mauled. My Braves will make it to the division series and lose yet again for 20 years running. But when you watch baseball, do you prefer watching your team play defense or offense?
I think most baseball fans would say offense, and I'd say I enjoy good pitching in battle, but it's just there's nothing nearly as fun as something like a inside the park home run, a rarity like that, or or a great stolen base or something along those lines. So I definitely would prefer seeing some sluggers go up to bat rather than seeing an incredible play that in the field.
Yeah, I think most people do enjoy seeing the hitting. The Braves used to have a guy named Ryan Klesko, and he said, "I swing as hard as I can in case I make contact," and he could rock it, And now the launch angle and all that stuff plays in. But anyway, I was a little different because growing up having 3 Hall of Fame pitchers, I was a pitcher myself. I enjoyed watching the pitching. I like watching Greg Maddux and Tom Glavine and John Smoltz go out there and mow people down, but I also enjoyed the hitting. But when you watch baseball, you can't just have your team do one thing, right?
That's true. So, and that's actually why the team I grew up on, the Brewers of the early 2000s, they did just one thing, and they did offense with a guy named Jeff Jenkins, who was probably the only guy who should have been in the majors. And because they only played offense with one guy, they did not result in having great seasons. I think they used to be like the worst team in baseball. Now I root for the worst team in baseball again.
It's just funny how that works itself out. With Jeff Jenkins, I remember him being pretty good, and Jeremy Burnitz was not bad, from what I remember. I remember his name and seeing the Braves play them sometime, but
Richie Sexton. For a while too.
So he's actually from Georgia, I think. But yeah, you team can't only do one thing, and so that kind of transitions us to what we want to talk about today, that a more biblical combination of not offense and defense, but of law and gospel or grace, and how it applies to our kids. So get us started off, Tony. What is this distinction between law and gospel, and why does it matter?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, an important question that's been talked about for literally thousands of years. And for my answer, we're
going to solve it all in the next few minutes.
Exactly. So I'm not going to directly read aloud some passages, but I'm going to say my understanding of that is very heavily rooted in Paul's teaching in Romans 7 and 8. And so I think the law was the first covenant that we couldn't keep. It was God's first promises, first initiated covenant with mankind by requiring perfect obedience in a sacrificial system to and some appearance wipe away sin. It did not truly wipe away sin. But under the law, we must be perfect as God is perfect, and we will get into heaven without question. The law allows getting into heaven by human works, but they'd have to be perfect works, which is a bit of a problem. So I actually think in that Romans seems to show us that Jesus is the one who fulfilled the law for us, and in that he that guaranteed a new covenant by his grace and through his blood shed for us. So I think I see the gospel as in a lot of ways the fulfillment of Jesus' obedience to the law for us. And so Romans actually says we died to the law. We became kind of widowed to the law. So that we could then become the bride of Christ and be married unto the gospel. But I think beyond that, there isn't beyond that, there is an element to which the law does speak to us. I mean, all Scripture is relevant to us. But this matters because our justification is at stake. If we do not understand the relationship between law and gospel, we don't understand how we are saved from our sin. So I don't know of anything bigger to get than this.
It is a really big deal. And, even as we talk about this, I look around my office and I have a couple of pictures of Martin Luther, who is a big proponent of the distinction between the law and the gospel. I think maybe sometimes in practice, he actually gave a little bit more adherence to the law than he would say. But, Luther was sort of go big or go home, say it hard or don't say it at all. Yep. And so, yeah, I mean, this matters very, very intensely for just day-to-day life. Now, there's been a renewed emphasis in the last, 15, 20 years or so on the gospel message itself, being clear about that, how it shapes the Christian life, how it shapes ministry, preaching, so many things. And there's these websites and conferences, the Gospel Coalition and Together for the Gospel and the Gospel Centered this and all that. So how has that been helpful for family life?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, by the way, I wonder at what point we go full circle and we have a book come out called The Gospel Centered Gospel.
You just wait.
But I think it has put God back at the center of the story. As much as it's easy to pick on it at times, I think it's done a lot of great work. And I think it's helped, as a result, our families to see it's not about them. And so, we often focus about like the specifics and the nuances of theology in the gospel-centered movements, or, even just the sometimes it can be a buzzword, but I think really much of what this has consistently done is put God at the center of our story, where I think so much of American Christianity has made it the story of us. God is our co-pilot, and I think that God is our co-pilot mentality is destroyed at its core by the gospel-centered movement, which is helpful for families. I think it has showed us, again, how much we need mercy from God and the futility of our attempts to be the good Christian kids for the kids in our ministry, or for parents to have just the kind of good Christian kid that is good enough on their own. I think it also has fueled us through grace, both in salvation. It has, obviously helped us see God's grace and salvation, but it's really fueled us also in understanding grace and how it defeats shame, and how God's grace, the good news, defeats idols, how we can really fight against those kind of things by the gospel, and how the gospel isn't just the ABCs of salvation, but you've mentioned before, the Tim Keller quote is the A to Z's of the Christian life, and I think that has largely come about from the gospel-centered movement, or come about again. What do you think, though, Ben?
Yeah, it has highlighted God at the center, and it has shown us that the gospel is relevant for everyday living. It's not just a message that unbelievers need. A passage I go to again and again talking about this to people is Romans 1, where Paul's writing to the church at Rome, people who believe the gospel, and he said, I've been eager to preach the gospel to you who are at Rome also. He's wanting to preach the gospel to unbelievers because they need to hear it. Now, we don't only preach the gospel, but we do need to hear it regularly. A Luther quote, we're talking about Martin Luther, a Luther quote that has stuck with me that I've learned from Mark Seifert, who's I know he was a professor of mine. I don't remember if he taught you in seminary.
I did not have him.
Who's actually a Lutheran now. But he said, Luther said, the gospel is a guest in our heart that we must invite back again and again. The law is just always there. They're condemning us, showing us how we don't measure up. And depending on the strength of our conscience, we may be even more aware of that, but we have to keep inviting the gospel back, that we don't stand or rise before God because of our performance, but because of Jesus as someone outside of us. And so I think that has helped just, how the gospel shapes marriages, and then how we teach our kids. And like you talked about we can't be the good Christian kid just on our own moral effort. I think when we forget how central it is, what we end up saying, like, okay, unbelievers need that gospel, and then we're sanctified by effort, and just being good. And that's not, Paul goes against that in Galatians 3, that you started by faith, you keep on by faith. So why is the law needed for people generally, or if you want to go with adults particularly, but why do we need the law?
Yeah, I'm going to answer this the same way that Christians have been answering this, that since at least the Reformation, I think in a lot of ways before. There's often been seen as three purposes of the law, and for people in general. First, the law is given to us to show us our sin and contrast the holiness of God. To really show us the gap then between us and God. And then I think the law is also given to restrain evil. It does not do this perfectly. In fact, even the Apostle Paul teaches that there's ways in which, he talks about he did not know what sin was until the law revealed it, and so he'd fall into sin. That doesn't mean that he wasn't a sinner before the law, but the law sees an opportunity through him, he says. But in general, I still think the Bible shows us that the law restrains evil in the world. And I think lastly, it helps us to know how God desires to be glorified. So it kind of reveals his truth, his way. And in that, you have to be very careful with that and allow the New Testament to interpret the Old Testament for us with that. But I still think that we clearly even Luther understood to some degree or another that the law is given also to help us know how God desires to be glorified.
Yeah, that's a good answer. I'm, Lord willing, on Sunday going to start teaching through the Ten Commandments in a Sunday school class, and just looking at, okay, what do we do with the Ten Commandments today? And looking at a book that somehow I got for free when we were in school, Words from the Fire, and it's Al Mohler unpacking the Ten Commandments. And he talked about that look at the law and that, are there two uses or are there three uses? And, he said how Luther, in one sense, said